Honorable Prime Minister, Cabinet members, senior civil servants and distinguished guests. First, let me say what a privilege it is for me, not just for me individually, but for me coming from Singapore, to be giving this inaugural lecture. Singapore, a small city-state. It is a real privilege, and I think it's a very impressive statement of your openness that you have an outsider coming to deliver this inaugural lecture. I'm told to be frank in order to be useful. But I will say at the outset that everything that I have to say is said as a friend. Singapore counts India as one of its closest friends. We are at a very unusual time in the world. We are a very unusual time in the world. I'll speak a bit closer to the mic. It is a time of great unfulfilled promise, but also a time of pessimism. Much of the advanced world is mired in difficulties. Europe and Japan have serious structural problems that they are trying to overcome without too much success so far. The US doing somewhat better, but subdued growth, and the labor force in the US, labor force participation in the US, is now significantly lower than where it was 8 or 9 years ago. Not a good recovery. China, for a long time the outperformer in the world, is now in a period of difficult and complex restructuring. And private investment in China has slowed dramatically for reasons that are not merely cyclical, but also have to do with the pace of reform and deregulation of the Chinese economy. But it's not just a period of pessimism over growth, but also a period where we are seeing a turn inward in the mood of politics and the mood of society, particularly in the advanced world. It's a pessimism that goes beyond economics, but it is a pessimism that is also based on policy failures, cumulative policy failures over several years in much of the advanced world, such that middle-class incomes have stagnated for a very long period of time, such that youth unemployment is at unacceptably high levels, in Europe especially, and most importantly, such that people don't trust each other the way they used to. In the US, in the 1950s, they used to speak of we. Today, it is us and them. There's a mood of distrust. Same thing in Britain, same thing in Europe. A mood of distrust within society and a mood of distrust against the rest of the world. But it does come out of cumulative failures in policy. And it is wrong to think that it comes out of the natural workings of globalization. There is no place in Asia for this pessimism, this negative narrative about globalization and the benefits we each get from interacting with the rest of the world, as Prime Minister Modi has just emphasized. In Asia especially, we have tremendous opportunities left ahead of us to open up, to integrate our economies, and to make sure that growth is inclusive and that we achieve broad-based prosperity for our people. India is uniquely positioned to recast the global narrative, to achieve broad-based prosperity through a deeper strategic interaction with the global economy. India's own needs require it, because India's potential is still unfulfilled. India needs to grow by 8 to 10% over the next 20 years if it is to create jobs for a youthful population, if it is to reduce the tremendous underemployment of its population, and if it is to achieve inclusive growth, including a significant shift of people from the lower income group to the middle income group, which is what China achieved, this shift of people not just from poverty to low income, but from low income to middle income. But India is in a position different from China. And the reason why I say India is uniquely positioned to recast the global narrative is because India is also an open society. It's a constitutional democracy with a diverse population. And India can show how it is possible with an open society and an open economy to achieve not just rapid growth, but inclusive growth for its people. This potential is fully within reach, but it cannot be achieved without significant changes. It cannot be achieved just on current day policies. It requires, as Prime Minister Modi just said, a rapid transformation, not gradual evolution. It requires bold and accelerated changes to free up its economy and to invest in its people. The challenge is less about ideology than about legacy, a legacy that comes from the sheer weight of laws and rules, of the bureaucracy, and of vested interests in society. And we have to tackle that legacy decisively to fulfill India's potential. It doesn't mean smaller ambition in government. It means a different ambition in government. Put broadly, India has over-intervened in its economy and under-invested in social and human capital. It has overreached itself in regulating its economy, but it has underinvested in social and human capital. And to achieve its full potential, it will therefore have to do less in some areas and do a lot more in other areas. It has to withdraw from its old roles of the state, economic regulation and ownership, that restrains private investment and job creation, and also preserves incumbents, existing players, at cost to new players. But it's not just about what you do less of, it's what you do more of, and what new ambitions have to inspire and energize the state. India has to invest in social mobility and in maximizing the skills and abilities of its people, as Prime Minister Modi also just highlighted. It has to invest in inclusive housing in cities, in a first-rate infrastructure, both through public and private investment. And it has to invest in a new world economy, in innovative capabilities, investing in an ecosystem that will help companies and people make the most of a new, technologically driven global economy. And it means that in each of these new ambitions, a new way of doing business in government, what the world now knows as the Modi way. Actions, not just ideas, intent, and promises. Or to borrow the mantra that Prime Minister Modi used, reform, perform, transform. In every field. That has to be the mantra in every field. But I have to say that there's a need for much greater urgency. And urgency does not come naturally in politics, anywhere in the world, and particularly in large societies. Urgency does not come naturally. The problems I described in the advanced world have come about precisely because solutions have been repeatedly postponed and the problems have been allowed to grow larger in the workforce, in skills, in the pension crisis that's growing day by day. Singapore had no choice from its very start but to act with urgency and to keep improving and keep transforming itself with a focus on results. We had no choice because we would not otherwise have survived. To survive and to be relevant to the world, we had to do everything we did well. We had to keep improving, and each time we reached a new level of achievement, we had to look for the next level. We could not just survive by being competent and being average. We had to be exceptional. But that was Singapore, a small city-state that had no choice. India is a vast nation with immense strengths from its history. And large countries often think that they have a choice. You don't have the same existential threat. But India too needs a sense of urgency because there's a race against demography and a race against intelligent machines. You have to provide opportunities quickly for a very large youthful population. And you have to act soon to take advantage of new technologies, whether it's artificial intelligence or robots or a whole range of new technologies that are now being developed, so that you avoid a digital divide, which is what we are seeing in some societies, and we maximize the potential of technology to improve the quality of every job, technology-augmented jobs that will enable higher productivity and higher incomes for the broad base of people. And India also has to act with urgency because there's still very large shortfalls in achieving basic human needs. There's been significant progress, particularly in the last 25 years, continuing in the last 2 to 3 years, but there's still large shortfalls in meeting basic human needs: clean water, sanitation, energy, housing, basic healthcare, social security. Still a huge social challenge, and it needs urgency. And India also has to move with urgency to achieve its potential. 8 to 10% growth is not a luxury. It will merely get India to about 70% of the per capita income of China in 20 years' time. It's not a luxury, because India, which had the same per capita income as China in the mid-1970s, now has almost 2.5 times lower per capita income than China. And with 8 to 10% growth, that's a significant catch-up while China slows down, but it still means, in 20 years' time, just 70% the level of per capita income of China. But India can achieve this, and there's no reason why it can't erase the deficits of the past. Frankly, India has the largest unfulfilled potential of any country I know of in the world, and it needs urgency to achieve this potential. The reforms are underway, and they're very impressive reforms in some cases. In fact, India even leads the world in some areas. You have the world's first digital identification infrastructure in Aadhaar. The world's first. Your infrastructure plans are now moving at a faster pace. Highways and roads, railways, energy, including renewable energy, and ports. So that's being stepped up. But the reform agenda is still largely unfinished, and the pace of change has to be stepped up. Rapid transformation, not gradual evolution. You're on a good wicket. You're on a good batting wicket. But you can't continue this process by scoring singles. You've got to go for 4s and 6s in every over, and you've got to go for a century in every other innings. That's the only way India is going to achieve its potential in the next 20 years. What are the most important shifts? What will lead to this leap in India's levels of productivity and per capita income? And what will lead to prosperity being broad-based and not just concentrated amongst the most successful? First, you have to focus on exports to the world. That's a glaring area of shortfall in the Indian economy. India has 18% of the world's population, but only 2% of the world's exports. And if you compare India with East Asia, your exports per person, per capita, is only one-fifth the level seen in China or Vietnam. So an export orientation is critical. And make in India has to be about making in India for the world. There's been very limited shift of people out of low productivity agriculture. That's the second reason why productivity is low overall. And there's been very little growth in formal jobs. Most of the workforce is in the informal economy. Only 10 to 20% of people are employed in the formal economy with regular pay increases, job security, and some chance of progression. India, more than any other major economy, has very few of its working people working in the formal economy. And that too holds back productivity growth and improvement. Fourthly, you have very few large firms. You have some exceptional firms, but you have few large firms and many small firms, and the gap in productivity between the large firms and the small firms is extremely wide in India. It's not a problem unique to India, but it is much sharper in India than in most other economies. This gap between the leading firms and the rest of the economy. Gap in productivity, in technology, in management know-how, and the skills of the people employed. It's an unusually sharp divergence in the Indian economy. And we know the reasons why, because your employment laws and your land acquisition laws actually discourage firms from becoming larger. And what it all amounts to at the end of the day is it's anti-employment legislation, because you're protecting the 10 to 20% of people in the formal economy at the cost of the 80% who have informal jobs. It is not just bad for growth, it's also inequitable. These four problems are interrelated. The lack of an export orientation, the lack of formal job opportunities, the limited shift out of agriculture into manufacturing and services, and the small number of large firms and the mass of very small firms. They're all interrelated. So what are the shifts that are required? First, India must go for a deeper strategic interaction with the global economy. And I use the word strategic for a reason. It's not just about the calculus of trade deficits and current account deficits, not just the calculus of which country is gaining and which country is losing. This is a strategic interaction with the world economy that will bring a new dynamic within India. Because it's not fundamentally about demand. It's not about domestic demand in the domestic markets versus external demand in global markets. And I must say the international organizations have not done us a service with this mantra of domestic demand as a source of growth in the emerging world. Because no sustained growth is achieved by focusing on one's own markets. And no sustained growth is achieved by focusing on demand. Sustained growth comes from supply, the quality of supply and the dynamic of continuous improvement. That's what leads to sustained growth. It is productivity growth that drives long-term growth, not demand. And the real logic of opening up to the world and of this deeper strategic interaction with the world is not the demand-side logic, but the supply-side logic. It's about constant learning and the discipline of constantly adjusting to the latest in best practices. Every time a buyer sends new specifications to the factory based on a new group of consumers, it's something new. Usually something a little more sophisticated, something more customized, something tailored to a new group of customers. Constant adjustment. It's not just about the technology and the machines. It's about management know-how, HR systems, what they call the tacit knowledge, not just the explicit knowledge that's written in the guidebooks, but the tacit knowledge that comes from participation in the world economy. Constant learning, constant updating, constant adjustment. And that is the real logic of opening up to the world. It's about the dynamic, the discipline of dynamism. The discipline of dynamism. That is the real logic of it. For any given level of demand, even in a world that's growing slowly, you can either have high exports and high imports, or low exports and low imports, for any given level of demand. But the big difference between high exports and high imports is this discipline of dynamism, the constant learning that comes from interacting with the world. And it's a learning where India will not just be a follower, but has the potential to be a leader in many fields. That learning amongst firms, amongst individuals, and in government is the real benefit of opening up our economy to the world. And India has come a long way in opening up its economy in the last 25 years, but it needs a much more concerted push in the next phase of this journey, which is why Made in India has to be made in India for the world. And if you can compete in the world, you will be able to compete in an open Indian market. Compete for the world market, and you will be able to compete in the domestic market. It cannot be a half-hearted strategy. And I should say, it cannot be a strategy which you sometimes get economists proposing, where you have a bit of export orientation and a bit of import substitution. Go for some increase in exports in one area and substitute for imports in another area. It doesn't work that way anymore, because the whole way in which production is being organized in the world today, in what they call global value chains, involves a very deep interaction between exports and imports in every production process, and domestic suppliers as well. This interaction between exporting, between domestic supplier to the exporter, and imported inputs is a complex and deep interaction that defines the world economy today. You take China. After China entered the WTO in 2001, brought down import tariffs. But when import tariffs were brought down, the result was a paradoxical one. Chinese exports ended up having more domestic content as a result of this liberalization. Why? Because a whole new set of domestic suppliers were able to take advantage of cheaper, better quality imports in order to supply competitively to the exporters. So it's a paradoxical result. Import tariffs went down, they liberalized, but domestic content of exports went up. And it's not an accidental outcome. That is precisely the logic, the supply-side logic of opening up to the world. It means it is not a zero-sum game. Opening up to the world and this deeper strategic interaction with the world is not a zero-sum game. It's not about one nation's gain at another nation's expense. At its heart, it's about constant learning, constant innovation that takes productivity up and takes incomes up. It's not a zero-sum game. But you have to move quickly because technology is evolving. As we all know, machines are getting more intelligent. Big data and artificial intelligence is also redefining the services industries, not just manufacturing. In 10 or 15 years' time, the opportunities we have today will no longer be there, because intelligent machines, artificial intelligence, and big data would be able to replace many of the tasks that are done by human beings today. But if we move today and get into the global value chains, both in manufacturing and services, we'll be able to get onto an escalator of skills, an escalator of innovation that will allow us to then take the most advantage of these new technologies to improve the quality of jobs. But we have to get on the escalator today. India does not lack capabilities. Look at your companies. If you look at this year's Forbes most innovative 100 companies, the 100 most innovative companies in the world, 3 of them were Indian companies. Hindustan, Unilever, TCS, Tata Consultancy Services, and Sun Pharma. Highly innovative companies, leaders in the world in their field. And there are many others. And these are not just companies that are competitive because of what they're doing in India. They are also themselves globalized. Sun Pharma has 70% of its revenues from outside India, mainly in the United States, mainly in specialty generics, specialty generic drugs. It produces in 26 countries, although it is anchored in India. That is the new game of competitiveness, to be globalized and to be a leader. But we have to spread this culture in the largest and most successful firms to the rest of the economy. It's a culture that exists in many fields in India. Take medical care. You have in India some of the highest quality medical care at a fraction of the cost of the advanced world. Places like Narayana Institute of Cardiac Scientists, which was started by Dr. Devi Shetty. You have some of the best academic health centers, academic health systems in the world. Christian Medical College in Vellore, which in fact the National University of Singapore and our National University Hospital collaborates very closely with in education and research. First-class institution. In every field, we have to spread the culture that exists in the leading players to the rest of industry. And it can be achieved. This culture of learning by doing and taking leaps forward, which eventually make you a leader. And surely, we will then have Olympians in many more fields of endeavor. Many more PV Sindhus and Sakshi Maliks are to come. But it's not even a situation as if there's no demand. I've elaborated on the supply side logic of opening up, but it's not as if there's no demand. The economists sometimes talk about trade growing slowly relative to global GDP. That's just because oil prices have come down and commodity prices have come down. In real terms, trade continues to grow faster than world GDP. And if you take out the fact that China was previously over-investing and now has to consolidate, if you take out that fact, all the more that the underlying trend of trade is that it is still a source of dynamism for the world economy. And in Asia, even more so, because our prospects for integrating our economies in Asia are still an unfulfilled task. Between Southeast Asia or ASEAN and China, there's a high degree of interaction. But between India and China and between India and ASEAN, there's a need for much deeper interaction. The total trade between India and China is only 3% of the trade of India and China with the world. In other words, our links between India and China are just 3% of the total trade of India and China. The total trade of India and Southeast Asia is only 4% of the total trade of India and Southeast Asia. There's tremendous opportunity to develop stronger links, both exports and imports, FDI flowing in both directions in order to integrate our economy. And remember, Asia is the biggest source of future demand in the global economy. We have to take advantage of it. So I've spoken about this deeper strategic interaction with the world, but I also then want to speak about the new role of the state. What is the new role of the government? What is the new ambition of the government? It is not to supplant markets. It is not to restrict competition by protecting incumbents. It is a new role that has to focus first in the economic sphere on promoting capabilities and skills that enable firms and the whole economy to be competitive. Promoting capabilities and skills, a supply-side emphasis. It's also about coordinating within each cluster, within each supply chain, so as to speed up the transfer of know-how and technologies from the leading players to the rest, from big to small, from foreign to local, local to foreign. But it is also fundamentally not just about economic policy. As Prime Minister Modi has emphasized, there is no strong economy and no strong nation without a strong society. And social policies and the interaction between social and economic policies have to be the primary arena for government ambition. That is the primary arena for government ambition. Social policy is, at the end of the day, economic policy. First, social mobility. Challenge all over the world, but challenge in India as well. And if there's one thing we've learned from the last 50 or 60 years of experiments everywhere in the world, we have to start as early as possible in a child's life. In fact, we have to start from the prenatal period with the mother. Prenatal interventions, interventions at childbirth, interventions in the first 18 months are critical, followed up by quality preschool opportunities. Some experiments in India taking place, some already giving good results. I know of the results of the initiative in Madhya Pradesh, for instance, as part of your integrated child development services, developed through the village level child and mother care centers. I think you call it the Anganwadis. Good results, just to show what's possible. In just 4 years, from 2005 to 2009, the percentage of underweight children came down from 60% to 48%. Percentage of children with stunted growth came down from 49% to 38%. And I'm sure there's been progress since then. I don't have the data beyond 2009. Things can be achieved with village-level interventions, mother and child, as early as possible. Schools are where it continues. After the early childhood years, it's schools. And I'll have to say, and again I have to repeat, I say this as a friend, schools are the biggest crisis in India today, and have been for a long time. Schools are the biggest gap between India and East Asia. And it is a crisis that cannot be justified. Just look at the data. 43% of students drop out before finishing upper primary school. 43% drop out before finishing upper primary school. There's a shortage of 700,000 primary school teachers. Only 53% of schools have girls' toilets. Only 74% of them have access to daily drinking water. And this is why, when India took part in the OECD study in 2009, what's called the PISA study, mathematics, science, problem solving, age 15, India was 73rd out of 74 countries. And this in a country which has exceptional talent, as we know. The people who go to your IITs and IIMs and lead companies all over the world are first-rate people. India has the biggest gap I know of, and I spent many years in education. It is the biggest gap I know of between the talent at the top and the unfulfilled potential of those in the rest of society. And these things can be fixed. And it is not, by the way, about ever-increasing budgets. My good friend, Mr. Arun Jaitley, is here. Singapore does not have a high education budget. We are, in fact, a bit on the low side. But we end up at the top or near the top of the OECD studies every time it is conducted. Math, science, problem solving. It is not about spending more and more, but it is about organization and culture. How do we recruit our teachers? How do we train them up? How do we hold the head teacher and the teachers accountable? How do we provide for quality across the system and not just at its most exclusive end? How do we ensure that every school is a good school? These are things that don't require an ever-increasing budget. It's about system and it's about culture. And it can be fixed. And then we go on to the tertiary education system. And here too, there's a big challenge. And it's not unique to India. All over the world, in the US, in Britain and Europe, in China, in Japan, in Korea, all over the world, we are overproducing graduates who go through a general academic education. We have over-academized learning, starting in school and continuing through the college system. And we're producing people who do not have the skills required in the real world. Every Indian employer tells us that. Employers in China tell us that. China too is overproducing graduates. In the US, 40% of college graduates end up doing a job which doesn't require a college to graduate. And this is after spending tremendous family resources on getting a college degree. We have to reorient our system to focus on the skills required in the real world. And this is not just for economic reasons, it is the way in which we develop the potential of people, maximize and stretch their potential by putting them on the skills pathway. It's about university graduates, it's about everyone, including the ITI graduates. The skills pathway. You look at Switzerland, or for that matter Singapore, relatively advanced small countries. We still have the majority of people each year leaving our schools but going through a technical education. Even in an advanced economy, that's what is needed. But it's not a dead end. It's a pathway for constant improvement in skills during your career. So we have to make this fundamental shift. And it's not too late as we expand tertiary education away from an overly academic education to one that creates this bridge between the academic and the real world, and especially one that focuses on the skills required for the future economy. And finally, human capital development is not just about what happens in the first 12 years or 18 years of our lives. It's about what happens throughout life. The most important initiative in Singapore, most important social and economic initiative, is now about lifelong learning. We call it Skills Future. We must have regular injections of learning throughout a person's working life. Whatever the job. Whatever the job. You may be a doctor, you may be a technician, you may be a chef, you may be someone working in building maintenance. Technologies change, market needs change, and we also need to refresh ourselves to keep our potential moving up. Lifelong learning is the whole new arena of education that has to be developed. And it means not front-loading education to the first 12 or 18 years of a person's life, particularly front-loading knowledge acquisition. It means developing this potential to learn through life and having an infrastructure in society that helps people to learn through life at the place of work, near the home, in society. This is a new direction for us in Singapore, but it's also a challenge which everyone faces. Let me finally say that cities play a very special role in this whole agenda. Cities play a very special role in reform, perform, and transform, particularly in a large continental scale society like India, because it is cities which are crucibles of both innovation and inclusivity. Why innovation? Because it's in cities that you can get that working relationship between government, business, colleges, ITIs, and schools, a working relationship at a city level that spurs skills acquisition. Why inclusivity? because it's in cities that you can not just provide infrastructure, that you can breed the interaction between people in their normal daily lives, interaction in their housing neighborhoods, interaction at work, breed the interaction that provides for social cohesion. Cities are crucibles of both innovation and inclusivity, and we have to empower them. Few countries do this well. You have to empower cities, hold them accountable, give them some financial autonomy, and have competition between cities. There's nothing like competition as well. Cities are going to play a special role in the future. And I'm glad that here too we are trying to play a role on India's journey. We've just launched, in fact, in April this year, an urban management program, which NITI Ayog is collaborating with Temasek Foundation and our Singapore Corporation Enterprise. 7 states, 115 officials. It's a small start, but critical that we share knowledge where we can. Urban management, waste management, water management, social urban planning, all the techniques that make cities a livable place and an inclusive place and an innovative place. Final point, I think I've spoken for too long. Again, at the end of the day, what we have to try to do is achieve what Prime Minister Modi emphasized in his speech. It's not just about budgets, it's not just about programs. It is at the end of the day about a social and political culture. And we have to take that very seriously. If you get the right social and political culture, by the way, a lot of other things come for free. We get a lot of things for free without additional budgetary expenditures. I'll give you 2 examples. First, our housing neighborhoods in Singapore are planned for interaction between the smallest units, which the poorest families live in, and the largest units where the upper middle class lives in. Planned for interaction, all a stone's throw from each other, shared facilities, shared parks, shared rivers and lakes, everything shared. No fences, no gates. 85% of Singapore lives in our public housing neighborhoods, 85%. But it means that although we've got disadvantaged families in Singapore, and we have disadvantaged individuals, we do not have a single disadvantaged neighborhood. Not a single disadvantaged neighborhood. Now, what does this do? It does, first from an economic point of view, it gives us something for free. House prices appreciate at roughly the same rate in the neighborhood. Between the homes owned by the poorer individuals and the homes owned by the upper middle income, for that matter, even the upper income who live in private property, they've all appreciated at the same rate. Home price appreciation, which is a very important part of wealth accumulation for retirement, has all appreciated at the same rate, not because of budgetary subsidies, but because of urban planning. But secondly, once we have that culture of interaction, which in Singapore, the most diverse country in the world, the most religiously diverse country in the world, and a multiracial society, once we have that interaction in our neighborhoods, in the kindergartens, in the schools, daily interaction, it also gives us a very precious asset, which is a comfort with each other and social cohesion that makes it possible for us to then do things together for the long term. And that brings me to the second point, which is that once we have a social and political culture that is focused on the long term and avoids the zero-sum games of the short term, where one person's gain is another person's loss, once we have that culture, it also gives us a lot of things for free. Because society and the electorate then have an interest in efficiency, in accountability, and results. And they understand that people who give promises of short-term results are not to be believed. This doesn't come naturally in most societies. It was not that way in Singapore before. But we developed this culture over time. And now it is not easy to give promises in Singapore without people looking at you with a certain skepticism. So a culture that focuses on the long term is essential for all that we want to achieve in an inclusive society. Short-termism is the enemy of social mobility, because whether it is prenatal care or early childhood or revamping our schools or improving tertiary education, it takes more than 2 or 3 electoral terms before we see results. But if we eventually do see results, and once a population understands that and trusts politicians who are investing in the long term and distrusts populations who offer a short-term promise, society then becomes its greatest asset. Individuals and people become the greatest asset for the future. And I'm sure India can achieve this new social dynamic and achieve its fullest potential. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, sir, for that extremely inspiring, thought-provoking, and motivating.
That was the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore speaking at the inaugural NITI Ayog's address, Transforming India. The Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, they are saying that there needs to be an ecosystem which needs to be created, and that needs to be technology-enabled. The Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore also added that India has the potential to achieve that. What it needs is the urgency to achieve, to realize that potential. India clearly has that potential. The Deputy Prime Minister also, they're saying that India is the world's first digital infrastructure network. It has become the world's first country to have achieved the digital infrastructure network, and that's applaudable. What needs is a rapid transformation, something that Prime Minister Modi also spoke about a short while back. The Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, they're also saying that exports to the world is what needs to be kept in mind, while also taking forward the Make in India campaign of the government of India. And India needs to go deeper into strategic interaction with the world economy. And of course, India does not lack in capability and innovation, so clearly exuding and expressing confidence in the Indian economy and the Indian society. The Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore, they're speaking at the inaugural NITI Ayog address, Transforming India. A short while back, Prime Minister Modi also spoke at the beginning, where the Prime Minister said the development of country depends on the quality of institution and ideas, and that we have to change laws, speed up processes, and adopt better technology. The Prime Minister there was speaking at the inaugural NITI Ayog's address, Transforming India. Prime Minister also putting forth his idea of a rapid transformation and not gradual evolution. The Prime Minister said that, of course, the ideas by various stakeholders are helping in making the policy better, in taking better policy decisions. Prime Minister Modi also said that the idea behind today's conference is to convert these ideas from various stakeholders into actions. The Prime Minister also stressing on how thinking, the culture of thinking needs to be made and needs to be encouraged among the youth, among the younger generation, and inspiring so differently that the government can no longer afford to remain rooted in the past. The Prime Minister also said that if India has to meet the challenge of change, mere incremental progress is not enough, rather a metamorphosis is needed. So that was the live that you were watching of the NITI Ayog inaugural address, Transforming India. The Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore delivering the keynote address, and Prime Minister Modi speaking at the beginning.